In the last hours of his life, an old Italian man asked to make his confession to Padre Pio. His name was Ernesto. He was 81 years old. He had attended Mass every single Sunday for more than 50 years. He had raised 5 children in the faith, seen them all confirmed, seen 3 of them married in the church. His wife, Giovanna, had been by his side for 40 years, faithful, devoted, respected in their village outside Foggia as the kind of Catholic couple young people were told to imitate. And now, in the autumn of 1958, with the smell of approaching death already in the room, Ernesto asked to see Padre Pio, not because he had committed great sins, but because of something much quieter, something he and Giovanna had decided together on a winter evening in 1919, just 3 years into their marriage. Something so small, so rational, so ordinary, that neither of them had thought to mention it in 38 years of confessions. Padre Pio heard it, and then he did something no one in the room had expected. He stopped. He sat very still. And then he said quietly to the nurse standing at the door, "Call the wife in. She needs to hear this too. Let me tell you something most people don't realize. I've been attending Mass since I was 4 years old. I sat in the same pew in Coventry for decades with my husband David beside me, and it wasn't until the 3rd year of our marriage that I understood something that frightened me. 2 people can be completely faithful to the church and completely strangers to each other's souls. That is the wound this video is really about. There is a particular kind of loneliness that no one talks about in Catholic circles. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look like crisis. It looks exactly like faithfulness. 2 people go to Mass together. 2 people say grace before meals. 2 people kneel side by side during the rosary, but inside there is a wall. Not a wall built from hatred or betrayal or unfaithfulness. A wall built from a single decision, made quietly, perhaps even sensibly, early in the marriage. The decision not to go deeper. The decision to keep the intimacy of prayer at the surface level. The decision that said, we are Catholic enough. What we do is enough. And that decision, that one quiet, eminently reasonable decision, Padre Pio said, was one of the most spiritually dangerous choices a married couple could make. Not because it looked evil, but because it looked perfectly fine. Because it allowed 2 people to live their entire lives, raise their children, bury their parents, grow old together, and arrive at the gates of death, having never once allowed God to reach both of them at the same time in the same room through the same prayer. Padre Pio once said to a young couple preparing for marriage in San Giovanni Rotondo, "The devil is not afraid of a couple who prays separately. He is afraid of a couple who prays together in the same breath before the same God with nothing hidden." They smiled at him. They thought it was a nice sentiment. 40 years later, one of them would be lying on a deathbed, asking Padre Pio to explain what had gone wrong. And Padre Pio would show them not a crime, not a betrayal, not a moment of weakness. He would show them the accumulation of 4 decades of choosing comfort over covenant. Stay with me. Because what Padre Pio saw in Ernesto's soul that day, and what he then saw in Giovanna's face when she walked into that room, will change the way you think about every marriage you've ever known, including your own. To understand what happened between Ernesto and Giovanna Martinelli, you have to understand the world they came from. They were married in November of 1918, just as the Great War was ending. Ernesto had survived the trenches. He came back from Caporetto, a changed man, thinner, quieter, with hands that sometimes shook when he thought no one was watching. Giovanna had waited for him through 4 years of silence and fear, keeping a candle lit before the statue of Our Lady in her parents' kitchen every single night. When he finally came home, they were married within 3 months. The church was full. The village celebrated. And in those first years, there was a quality to their faith that was almost raw. Ernesto had seen death too closely not to pray. Giovanna had prayed too desperately not to feel that prayer was real. In the early years of their marriage, they prayed together every evening before bed. Not just the rosary, but real conversations with God. Ernesto speaking in his rough, direct way, Giovanna in her more tender, searching way. It was imperfect. Sometimes they disagreed about what to ask for. Sometimes Ernesto felt embarrassed and fell silent. Sometimes Giovanna felt she was carrying the prayer for both of them. But they did it. They showed up before God together. And then came the winter of 1919. Ernesto had found work in a factory outside Foggia. Money was tight. The hours were brutal. He came home every evening exhausted, and the evening prayer started being cut short. A quick Hail Mary instead of a full rosary. And one night, after a particularly hard week, Giovanna said something she thought was generous. "You need to rest. We can each pray on our own tonight." Ernesto was grateful. "Just tonight," he said, but tonight became tomorrow. Tomorrow became next week, and somewhere in those gradual adjustments, the couple who had once prayed together every evening became a couple who prayed alone, separately, in their own corners of the same house. They never stopped being faithful. They never stopped going to Mass. They never stopped considering themselves a devout Catholic family. They had simply, quietly, without ever making it official, stopped praying together. And here is what Padre Pio said about that kind of gradual withdrawal. And this is documented in a letter he wrote to his spiritual director, Padre Benedetto of San Marco in Lamis, in the early 1920s. "I see many souls who pray faithfully as individuals, but have allowed the altar of their family to grow cold. They offer God their personal prayer and withhold from Him the one thing He desires most from a married couple. Their shared surrender, their covenant prayer, the moment when two become one not in flesh, but in spirit before Him." That letter is preserved in the Capuchin archives. It was written to address something Padre Pio was seeing repeatedly in his work as a confessor. Couples who were individually devout, but spiritually separated. And he believed, and this is critical, that the choice to stop praying together was never truly neutral. It always had a cost that accumulates slowly, invisibly, like rust on iron, until the day comes when someone reaches for the connection that should have been there for 40 years and finds that the hinges have seized completely. Hold on, because in a moment I'm going to tell you exactly what Padre Pio saw when he looked at Ernesto's soul after 40 years of that choice. But first, you need to understand something about how Padre Pio read souls, and why what he saw in that room was described by witnesses as one of the most disturbing and most hopeful visions he ever shared openly with those present. Those who were present in San Giovanni Rotondo on the morning Ernesto Martinelli made his final confession have left accounts that were gathered by the Capuchin friars in a collection of testimonies compiled during Padre Pio's beatification process. The testimony that concerns us here comes from a friar named Brother Giacinto, who was serving as an assistant on the day in question, helping Padre Pio move between rooms due to his increasingly painful stigmata wounds. Brother Giacinto wrote that Padre Pio entered Ernesto's room at approximately 7 in the morning. The old man was propped against pillows, still conscious, but clearly near the end. Padre Pio sat beside him, received his confession in the normal way, and then, this is the part Brother Giacinto described as unusual, simply remained seated in silence for several minutes after Ernesto had finished speaking. He did not give the absolution immediately. He sat, and his eyes, according to Brother Giacinto, were looking at something that was not in the physical room. Then Padre Pio spoke. He told Ernesto what he saw. And because I want you to understand the full weight of this, I'm going to tell you exactly what the testimony records. Padre Pio described seeing Ernesto's soul as a house that had been well built, strong walls, good foundation, clean rooms. But in the center of the house, where a hearth should have been, where the warmth should have originated, There was a space that had grown cold, not destroyed, not filled with anything dark, simply cold, unused. Like a fireplace that had been blocked off 40 years ago because lighting it seemed like too much effort, and everyone had gotten used to wearing extra layers instead. Padre Pio told Ernesto that this was not a sin of commission. It was not something terrible that had been done. It was something essential that had simply been allowed to slowly stop. The covenant prayer of the marriage, the moment of daily surrender together before God, had been replaced over 4 decades with parallel acts of individual piety that, while genuinely good in themselves, had allowed the spiritual core of the marriage to go cold. And then Padre Pio said something that Brother Giacinto underlined 3 times in his testimony. The coldness has not stayed in that one room. It has moved through the house. What did he mean? He meant this: when the habit of praying together dies in a marriage, something begins to die in every other form of sharing too. Not immediately, not dramatically, but the spiritual distance that begins in prayer gradually migrates into communication, into patience, into forgiveness, into the ability to truly see one another as souls rather than as familiar furniture. Ernesto and Giovanna had spent 40 years being excellent companions, good co-parents, reliable neighbors. But at the deepest level, at the level of souls, they had grown more and more alone. Ernesto, lying there dying, realized something that he had spent decades avoiding. There were entire rooms of his inner life that Giovanna had never seen, and there were rooms of hers that he had stopped asking about, not from cruelty, from habit, from the accumulated weight of a choice made in 1919 that said, in essence, we don't need to go that deep together. It's enough to go to Mass. It's enough to do the external things. Let the interior life be private. Padre Pio leaned toward the dying man and said, "She is in the next room. Do you want her to know? I've seen it with my own eyes, in my own marriage, what happens when a couple stops praying together. I'm Margaret Ashford, and I have to tell you this honestly. After David and I let our evening prayers drift, and it was gradual, just like with Ernesto and Giovanna, just like it always is, I noticed something that I couldn't name for years. I would look at my husband across the dinner table and feel that he was someone I knew very well and barely knew at all. We were faithful. We went to Mass. We said grace. But something in the center was different from what it had been in the early years. It wasn't until I read an account similar to what I'm sharing with you today that I finally understood. The center had cooled, and we had let it happen one skipped prayer at a time. Ernesto said yes. He wanted Giovanna to know. And this is where the testimony of Brother Giacinto becomes almost unbearable to read. Giovanna entered the room expecting what any wife expects when called to a deathbed: to comfort, to hold a hand, to be strong. She was 62 years old. She had grey hair and a black wool dress, and the particular composure of a woman who has survived hard decades through willpower and faith. She sat on the other side of her husband from Padre Pio. She took his hand, and Padre Pio looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, and then he said, "He wants to tell you something he should have told you 30 years ago." Giovanna turned to Ernesto, and Ernesto, dying, told her, "I stopped knowing how to pray with you. I never learned again. I should have asked you to help me. Every year I told myself next year, and now there is no next year." Brother Giacinto writes that Giovanna did not weep immediately. She sat very still, and then she said something that he recorded verbatim. "I've been waiting for you to ask me that since 1923. But here is what no one in that room was prepared for. What Padre Pio saw next, when he looked at both of them together in that room for the first time, was not what he expected. And it is what he said in that moment that completely reverses what you think you understand about what had happened to their souls. Because the conclusion you have been drawing for the last several minutes, that 40 years of spiritual distance had permanently damaged what God had joined, is not the conclusion Padre Pio reached, not even close. Padre Pio had been examining souls for decades. He had seen souls destroyed by violence, by lust, by hatred, by pride. He had seen souls so darkened by serious sin that he had physically recoiled. He had seen souls so bright with grace that he had wept with joy. But Brother Giacinto writes that what happened when Padre Pio looked at Ernesto and Giovanna together in the same room at the same moment, both of them having finally acknowledged the thing that had been unspoken for 40 years, was something he had never quite seen before. He described it in the testimony as follows. Padre Pio's face changed. It became very still, and then he smiled. Not the polite smile he sometimes used to comfort, a real smile, as if he had seen something he recognized and was glad to see again. What had he seen? He had seen the cold hearth respond. He had seen, in the mystical language of his charism, that the capacity for covenant prayer between Ernesto and Giovanna had not been destroyed by 40 years of neglect. It had been suppressed, covered over, gone cold. But the capacity itself, the original grace of their sacramental marriage, had never left. It was still there, waiting, and the moment Ernesto spoke the truth and Giovanna answered with hers, it had done something that Padre Pio recognized. It had responded, like coals that looked dead but still held heat underneath. This is the reversal that no one saw coming. The 40 years had not destroyed what God had joined. The 40 years had buried it. And the burial could be undone, not perfectly, not without cost. There would be grief, Padre Pio told them, for what had been lost. Real grief that they had to allow themselves to feel. But the structure of their marriage, what the Church calls the bond, the sacramental reality, was intact. It had never been neutral. It had been waiting for them to come back to it. Padre Pio gave Ernesto absolution. He held both their hands. And then he said something to Giovanna that she would later repeat to a Capuchin nun in San Giovanni Rotondo, and that the nun preserved in her own written account, "The years are not lost, they are asleep. What you do in the time remaining will wake them up." Few Catholics know this, but this is exactly what the Church teaches about the nature of the sacrament of marriage. The grace is not destroyed by neglect. It becomes dormant. It waits. And the act of returning to covenant prayer, two people kneeling before God together, deliberately with nothing hidden, has been described by spiritual directors across centuries as one of the most powerful acts of sacramental renewal available to a married couple. Padre Pio understood this with a clarity that came from having seen it in hundreds of souls. The coldness was real, the loss was real. But so was the latent fire still buried under 40 years of ash. There is a detail in the beatification testimonies that most people overlook, and I think it matters enormously. When Brother Giacinto described Padre Pio's reaction to the Martinellis in that room, he noted something about the physical atmosphere. He wrote that at the moment Giovanna spoke those words, "I've been waiting for you to ask me that since 1923. There was a brief, unmistakable scent of roses in the room. Not from any flowers, not from perfume. The scent that those who knew Padre Pio associated with his mystical presence, the sign of something spiritually significant taking place." Brother Giacinto wrote that it lasted perhaps 30 seconds and then was gone. Padre Pio himself said nothing about it. He simply smiled again and held their joined hands a moment longer before speaking. Those of us who have followed Padre Pio's life know what that scent meant. It meant heaven was paying attention to what was happening in that room. It meant that the prayer of 40 years ago, the prayer they had stopped saying together, was somehow present in that moment, recognized, honored. It meant that the covenant had never truly gone silent, even when the couple had. Ernesto Martinelli died 3 days later. He died holding Giovanna's hand. Brother Giacinto writes that in the final hours they prayed together, haltingly, imperfectly, after 40 years without practice, using words that were simple and a little awkward and completely genuine. Ernesto couldn't manage the full rosary. They said 3 Hail Marys together in a whisper, and that was enough. Padre Pio, when he was told afterward, said only, "Good, 3 is enough to begin." But the story doesn't end there, because Giovanna Martinelli lived for another 11 years after her husband's death. And in those 11 years, she did something that became well known among the Capuchin community and that several of the friars referenced in letters from the period. She dedicated herself to what she called making up the years. Not with spectacular devotion, not with pilgrimages or elaborate novenas, simply with the practice that she and Ernesto had abandoned in 1919. Every evening, at the time when they used to pray together, she would set 2 chairs facing the wall where she kept a crucifix. She would sit in one chair, and she would leave the other one empty, and she would say, "The Rosary," out loud, as if speaking to someone sitting next to her, covering the decades they had lost together. Those who knew her said it was one of the most quietly powerful sights they had ever seen. A woman in her 70s, speaking her evening prayers to an empty chair, as if recovering a conversation that had been interrupted 40 years earlier and was simply resuming now. One of the Capuchin friars who knew her in those final years wrote, "She didn't seem sad when she prayed that way. She seemed like someone who had found something they had been looking for. She would tell us, 'I know where he is now, and he can hear me, so I pray for both of us until we are together again. But here is what I haven't told you yet.'" 11 years after Ernesto's death, Giovanna herself came to the end of her life. And the account of what happened in her final week, and what a visiting priest who had heard her story reported back to the Capuchin community, is the part of this story that will stay with you longest. Because in it, Padre Pio's words from that deathbed in 1958 are either confirmed or challenged in the most final and irreversible way possible. In the spring of 1969, Giovanna Martinelli was dying in a small hospital in Foggia. She was 73 years old. One of her daughters, Elena, sent word to San Giovanni Rotondo asking if any of the friars could come. Padre Pio himself had died in September of 1968, just months before. But a younger friar, Brother Anselmo, who had known Padre Pio well and had heard the story of the Martinellis directly from Brother Giacinto, made the journey. He sat with Giovanna, and in a written account that a researcher from the Padre Pio prayer groups found in the Capuchin archive in the 1990s, he left a record of what those final days were like. He wrote, "She was not afraid, she was not confused, she was simply ready, and she kept saying the same thing in those last days every time she woke up. I know what it was. It was just one choice, and then we chose again at the end, and that is what God kept." She seemed to believe with complete conviction that the covenant between her and Ernesto had been honored at the end, that the 11 years of her empty chair prayer had been heard, that the cold room in the house of their marriage had been warmed again, not completely, not as it would have been if they had never let it go cold, but enough. She said, "Enough is more than enough when God is the one completing it." Brother Anselmo writes that Giovanna died peacefully on an April morning, holding a rosary that Elena said had belonged to Ernesto, and that in the hours before her death, Elena observed something that she reported to the friars. Her mother had placed 2 rosaries on the blanket beside her, her own and Ernesto's, and she had arranged them so that their crucifixes touched. Now, I want to be very clear about something, because this is where the spiritual teaching gets precise, and where Padre Pio's insight goes beyond what most people expect from this story. What Padre Pio was pointing to in that room in 1958 was not simply a devotional practice. He was not saying, "You should have done more rosaries." He was identifying something that is specific to the sacrament of marriage itself, something different from individual prayer, different from going to Mass, different from any other spiritual practice either spouse might engage in separately. Marriage, as the Church teaches and as Padre Pio understood in a mystical way that went deeper than theology, is a sacrament that is meant to be lived actively, not just contracted at the altar and then maintained through external fidelity. The grace of the sacrament flows through the marriage. And prayer together, covenant prayer, the shared act of coming before God, not as individuals, but as the unit that God Himself joined at the altar, is the primary channel through which that grace continues to flow. When that channel is closed, the grace doesn't disappear, but it slows, it pools somewhere behind the blockage, and the souls of both spouses begin gradually to be nourished less, not from a lack of individual effort, but from the specific drought that comes when the shared wellspring dries up. This is what Padre Pio saw in Ernesto's soul, not a man who had failed to pray, but a man whose marriage had stopped being a source of sacramental grace because the shared channel had been closed. And this is what he confirmed when he looked at Giovanna. The same drought in a different form. The same thirst for something they both had access to but had stopped offering each other. The same cold hearth in the center of what should have been a warm house. And here is the most important thing I want you to understand. This is not about blame. Ernesto and Giovanna were not bad people. They were not lazy Catholics. They were genuinely faithful by every visible measure. The choice they made was not made in malice. It was made from exhaustion, from awkwardness, from the natural human tendency to let the difficult thing slide when the easy thing is available. But Padre Pio's insight was this. In marriage, the difficult thing, the thing that feels vulnerable, that requires you to show your interior life to another person, that demands genuine joint surrender before God, is precisely the thing that cannot be allowed to slide, because it is the thing that everything else depends on. This changed everything for me when I first read accounts like this one. My husband David is a quiet man, a reserved man, the kind of Englishman who finds open prayer more uncomfortable than a cold bath. I understood that. I accommodated it for years, and I told myself I was being kind. What I was actually doing, and I say this with full honesty now, was removing the very thing our marriage most needed. Not because I didn't love him, but because I valued his comfort more than I valued our covenant. Padre Pio would have recognized that immediately. You just spent time with one of the most quietly devastating and ultimately hopeful stories I have ever come across in my years of studying Padre Pio's life. You heard how 40 years of one small choice can reshape two souls, and how God, in His mercy, honored the 11 years a widow spent praying beside an empty chair. These accounts don't reach most people. They sit in archives. They circulate quietly among those who know where to look. If this channel has given you something real, something you will carry with you tonight and beyond, then consider using the super thanks button below. It tells the algorithm that this kind of content matters. It keeps these archives open. It keeps the search going. And it's you saying, this work is worth continuing, because it is. These souls deserve to be remembered, and the graces they found at the end deserve to reach every married couple watching right now who still has time. So what do you do with all of this? If you're married, or if you know a couple who is, and if any part of this story landed somewhere real for you, I want to give you exactly what Padre Pio gave to couples who came to him struggling with this particular spiritual drought. Not theory, a practice, concrete, specific, repeatable. Padre Pio called it the 5 minutes the devil hates most. Not a full rosary, not a long demanding prayer service. 5 minutes, together, before bed, or after the evening meal, or at whatever moment exists in your day where you are both physically present and not distracted. In those 5 minutes, one Our Father, spoken slowly, out loud, both voices together. One Hail Mary. and then a minute of silence, side by side, in which both spouses offer to God whatever is heaviest in their interior life at that moment. No words required during the silence, just the presence. Together. Padre Pio said that the enemy attacks this specific practice with particular force because he knows what it produces: a renewal of the sacramental channel. Expect resistance. Expect one of you to feel silly or tired or to suggest doing it later. Do it anyway, 5 minutes, every day for 1 week, and then see, quietly, honestly, whether something has shifted. For those of you whose spouse is not willing, and I know there are many of you watching right now, carrying this particular kind of loneliness alone, Padre Pio addressed this explicitly. He told a woman in this situation, and the testimony comes from Brother Modestino, who preserved it in his own notes. Your prayer for the two of you, offered with the intention of the covenant you made at the altar, reaches God as if both of you are kneeling. The specific practice he recommended: light a candle before the Blessed Mother. Say the first decade of the rosary out loud, slowly. And at the end, add this intention: Mother of God, carry this prayer to my spouse where I cannot reach. Let what I offer tonight be sufficient for both of us, and let the grace of our marriage, which comes from God and not from our feelings, continue to flow between us. Then extinguish the candle. Do not make a drama of it. Do not expect an immediate result. Do it again tomorrow. Padre Pio told that woman, you are not waiting for him to change. You are keeping the channel open on your side, and when God moves, the water will be ready to flow. And for those of you who, like Giovanna in her later years, are praying for a spouse who has already died, this practice is entirely valid in Catholic theology, and Padre Pio affirmed it repeatedly. The bond of sacramental marriage does not simply cease at death. The prayers of the surviving spouse for the soul of the departed are among the most powerful and specific forms of intercession available. If you find yourself in this position, if you carry the weight of things left unfinished, prayers not prayed, conversations not had, know this: it is not too late. Pray your rosary for your spouse. Offer your mass intentions for them. And if it helps you to pray out loud, as if they were present, do that. The Church does not discourage it. The communion of saints is real. The covenant made before God at the altar is real. And what Giovanna understood in those 11 years of sitting before an empty chair, saying Hail Marys out loud, was not a consoling fantasy. It was the theological reality that death does not dissolve the sacramental bond. It transforms it, and the prayer continues across the threshold. I had relatives, women I knew well in Coventry, who spent decades carrying grief about things left unsaid with their husbands. I shared with one of them what Padre Pio said about the covenant continuing past death, about the empty chair not being empty in the way we fear. She went very quiet for a long moment, and then she said, I can still do something. I'm not too late. That is what this teaching does. It gives people something to do with their grief that is not just grief. It gives them a practice, a direction, a prayer, and it roots that practice in the actual sacramental reality of what their marriage was and still is. If you take nothing else from today's video, take this. The choice Ernesto and Giovanna made in 1919 was undone. Not perfectly, not without loss, but undone. 40 years of cold ash, and underneath it, the ember was still there, waiting for someone to bend down and breathe on it. And at the end of their lives, they found it. You are watching this right now, which means you have not run out of time. Whatever choice was made in the past, whether you made it or someone you love made it, the ember is still there. Padre Pio said it himself, and I believe it with everything I am. The years are not lost, they are asleep. What you do in the time remaining will wake them up. David and I started doing the 5-minute practice years ago, after I first read a story like this one. I'll be honest with you, It was awkward at first. We are both English, which means we would rather climb a mountain in winter than show emotion openly to someone we love. But we did it anyway. And I can tell you now from the other side of that awkwardness that it is the single best thing we have done for our marriage since we said our vows. Start tonight. 5 minutes, that's all. And one last thing before I go. I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt what I described at the beginning of this video? That particular Catholic loneliness where you're faithful but somehow disconnected from the person beside you in the pew? Tell us in the comments. Be honest. You might be speaking for someone else who is watching right now and desperately needed to know they're not alone. Or if you've experienced what Giovanna experienced, praying across a distance, physical or spiritual, write it below. We read every single one. And if this video reached you for a reason, I'd love to hear why. Write the word covenant in the comments if you're going to try the 5-minute practice tonight. Let us know you were here, and let us know that Ernesto and Giovanna's story meant something to you, because it certainly means something to me.